Right, very good. Well, thank you very much. Good to see you all today. And on the importance of biodiversity in the farmed landscape. So, as Jeff was saying there, I'm going to introduce some of the technical terms and the terminology that we're going to be using in here, so explaining some of the basics, then why this is important in a New Zealand farming context and the unusual situation we find ourselves in farming in New Zealand and the ecosystems we are farming. Then look at some stuff around ecosystems, and I'm going to wrap up by explaining biocontrol and how that fits into everything here. So biodiversity, fairly obviously, it's a contraction of the term biological diversity, and it is the variety and variability of everything on the planet. So everything from the tiniest things like viruses all the way up to the big old blue whales. And it's not just the species. Commonly we think about biodiversity as being lots of different species, but it's also within species variability as well. The variability of ecosystems themselves. The land, the waters, oceans, streams, absolutely all environments and at all scales. In New Zealand, we tend to think about biodiversity, our national environmental organisation, forest and birds. We really get fascinated with the trees and the feathered stuff. There's more biodiversity in the soil than there is in any above ground forest in New Zealand or anywhere else in the world. So every kind of conceivable ecosystem. At a slightly more technical level, us as scientists, we really bury down into this stuff. So we start thinking about the variability of genes and species within an ecosystem. That taxonomic diversity, that's the species thing, but also the diversity of different ecosystems. New Zealand's a really interesting place. We have a lot of different ecosystems, all the way to the top of our mountains. All those different ecosystems are part of biodiversity as well. And down the bottom, functional diversity. This is one that's really overlooked. To use the slightly cliched African plains, it's covered in herbivores. There's lots of different species there, but they're all herbivores. There's not much functional diversity in that. And when you get into the real guts of ecology and ecosystems, it's that functionality that is really important. So a bit of biodiversity terminology. Endemic means it only exists in a particular place. And New Zealand is the world's leader in having the largest number of endemic species. We are a unique ecosystem. Everywhere else on the planet is covered in mammals. And until us lot turned up, there was only 3 mammals in New Zealand, bats, that had flown here. The kind of next step up, something's indigenous or it's native. It exists in a place, but also other places as well. So pukekos here, purple swamp hens over in Australia, basically the same kind of thing. And then exotic, or introduced or non-indigenous. These are species that we humans have introduced into a place. So there are things blowing over from Australia. There's lots of things blowing over from Australia, but there's new species that have arrived since humans have been in New Zealand. They are not exotic. They got here under their own steam. You're only classed as exotic if humans brought you into an ecosystem. Then we have this kind of curious category, particularly for New Zealand, this valued introduced species. We've introduced lots of stuff into New Zealand and they've become problems. There's a lot of stuff we've introduced and it's actually considered to be valuable. So there's kind of real quite value judgment in here. And then the kind of final term is cosmopolitan. Humans are of course the most cosmopolitan species on the planet. Another example is orcas, killer whales. Clearly not on land, fortunately, but they're in the oceans and the seas across the entire globe. And as I touched on New Zealand at the start just there, New Zealand has the highest level of endemic species in the world, about 80,000. It's quite astonishing. And currently, very large numbers of those are at risk of extinction. So kind of meshing in with what we're discussing here today is the fact that we have lots of endemic species at risk of extinction, and how can farming play its part in looking after them. And this to me is a really fascinating thing. As you can probably still tell from my accent, I'm a POM originally. When you look at our farming systems, everything, all the crops, all the stock, all the pests, all the weeds, all the diseases, they're all exotic. There's literally a handful of native insects that are pests in our farming systems, and that's about it. It's quite astonishing. So when we start talking about biodiversity on farm, we kind of have this interesting juxtaposition. When we think about biodiversity in New Zealand, we're thinking about the forest and bird, the dock estate stuff, but then our whole farm system is completely exotic. Indeed, when I first arrived in New Zealand some considerable time ago, having cut my teeth in organic vegetable farming in the UK, I came to New Zealand, I was going, great, I'm going to find a whole load of really interesting new weeds that I can find some interesting new ways of controlling. And I turned up, and what did I find? Bloody fat hen everywhere. It's like, God, I just had this at home. You know, where's something new and different? The farming systems are literally all transported predominantly from Northern Europe and dumped here. And excluding us, the Aussies, and part of America, partly American farming systems, if you look through Europe, through Asia, through Africa, the farming systems there are indigenous. They are farming their indigenous species. So, this to me is a really interesting question in this space. When we talk about increasing biodiversity in New Zealand, particularly on farm, are we thinking indigenous biodiversity? Are we thinking the exotic biodiversity? And how do those two things relate to each other? This to me is a really big open question in this space. Increasing farm biodiversity, but how does this exotic and indigenous biodiversity relate to each other? So it really is a big question. I don't think we've actually been asking this question very long in New Zealand either. Right, some more terminology. Just to be really confusing, us scientists start talking about natural enemies, and then we start talking about beneficial insects, and then we start talking about biocontrol agents. You guys are going, whoa, what was going on here? They are basically the same thing. It's just kind of a bit of context where we use these different names. So when we're talking about natural enemies, we're just talking about stuff, beneficial insects, arthropods to be technically correct, that are eating our pests. We start calling them natural enemies when they're attacking our pests without us having to do anything. We start calling them beneficial insects, which is what we're going to be talking about mostly today, when we start giving them a bit of a hand so they can do their job better. And then we start calling them biocontrol agents when you've got a glass house, you've got some aphids have arrived, you go down the biocontrol shop, you get some biocontrol agents, aphidius, and you chuck them into your glass house. So they're all basically just arthropods, but it's the kind of context we give them different names. And another bit of terminology, ecosystems, obviously an ecological system. And ecology is this science of how species and individual organisms interact with themselves and their non-living environment, the climate, the rocks, etc. like that. And if you start burying into ecology, it is this truly ginormous science. It has dozens of subdisciplines within it. And the interesting thing about ecology is these species are interacting with themselves, and then the ones they were interacting with are then interacting back. It's a circular system, same as evolution. And these circular systems build vast amounts of complexity. So all the complexity we see in ecosystems is basically feedback systems. And linking the two together, biodiversity is a really important facet of ecosystems. And it's a key driver of ecosystem function. So that functioning stuff, what's actually happening here, not just what the head count of species is. So that brings us into the ecosystem services. So these are the services ecosystems provide to us. So it is a very human-centric view of the world. And biodiversity is a really important driver of a good functioning ecosystem. So biodiversity therefore drives ecosystem services. So ecosystem services were developed about a century ago, and depending on who's doing the counting, there's about 20 different ones. And the most important one for us is down the bottom here, pest and disease regulation. And there's a bit of pollination right next to it down there as well, at just gone past 6 o'clock. So, ecosystem services. Who likes breathing? Anybody kind of tired of oxygen? You know, oxygen, it's so 2010s. You know, all the cool people are into argon now. You know, You know, anybody still breathing oxygen? Losers. Clearly oxygen is an ecosystem service. And back in the 1990s, a guy called Bob Constanza tried to value ecosystem services. And one of the slightly smart-ass reviewers of his initial draft of his paper said, "A valiant effort at trying to value infinity." You know, how much is oxygen worth to you? You know, if nature stopped providing oxygen, how much would you pay to buy oxygen from somewhere else? You know, you basically pay everything you've got, because otherwise you're dead. You know, this is kind of the fundamental importance of ecosystem services. They're keeping us alive and they make the whole planet function. So when old Bob did try to total up infinity and got a slightly smaller figure, he found the actual value of ecosystem services were multiple times that of global GDP. The value of those of ecosystems to humanity is far more than the entire value of our economic system. Vastly greater. Clearly, it's basically infinite. And when we come down to pest and disease regulation as an ecosystem service, if there wasn't a whole bunch of pest management going on for free out there, I can guarantee you, you would not be able to grow food. You would virtually have to be continuously hosing crops in agrochemicals to keep the pests at bay. It's astonishing how much stuff is being regulated with us doing basically nothing. Got everything on that one, yes. So the problem we have created we have created for ourselves, is we've created very simplified ecosystems on our farms. Monocultures, basically. If you've got a paddock and it's just got one species in it, and a pest rocks up and goes, that eats that particular crop species, it's got this massive banquet in front of it, and nothing between it and its banquet. So it's completely no surprise that that pest becomes a problem, because there's a huge amount of food for it and nothing to stop it. There's also in that monoculture very little space or nice environments or alternative food for our beneficial insects that can control that pest. Indeed, if you wanted to design a farm system to pretty much guarantee pest and disease outbreaks, you couldn't go past monoculture. It would be the most effective way of generating pests and diseases. So we really have hoisted ourselves on our own petard here. So this is where this kind of exotic farming system thing comes back into play in terms of New Zealand and what we're doing here. The whole system is exotic, including the natural enemies. Some of them came over accidentally when we introduced our crops and stuff. There's a few endemic species in New Zealand that can also be beneficial. Indeed, I often wonder, I kind of go, with what we know now, if we found another New Zealand somewhere that somehow had missed off Google Earth, we went, hey, great, we've got this entirely exotic ecosystem here. Let's import our farming system into it, but let's leave all the pests, all the diseases, and all the weeds behind. Can you imagine what that kind of farming would be like? You'd basically just shove something in the ground, walk away, come back when it's ready for harvest, because there are no pests or diseases or weeds to attack it. So the question here is, okay, we've got mostly exotic natural enemies, but when you look back at the native ecosystems from where our farming systems came, there's vastly more natural enemies there. We've only imported a small number over, either deliberately or accidentally. So if we want these guys to do more pest control, we're really going to have to give them the biggest hand as possible. And that's where we come into conservation biocontrol. So let's have a look at our biocontrol. First up, it's an ecological management system. And what we're doing is using these ecological interactions, predation, parasitism, disease, herbivory, and competition, to manage our pests. Competition is particularly important in the weed space and using intercropping. So biocontrol is broken down into three types. Importation, typically called classical, which is a bit of a meaningless name, augmentation, and conservation. So just knock the first two on the heads quickly so we know what we're talking about. New Zealand, closely followed by Australia, is a world leader in importation because we have a highly endemic ecosystem into which we've introduced a whole lot of exotics, a bunch of which have become pests. So what we do for the pests, go back to their point of origin, find their natural enemies, bring them over, rename them biocontrol agents, and hopefully they bring the pest back under control by exerting ecological regulation back onto that pest. Augmentation's got two subforms. Inoculative release. This is your classic glasshouse biocontrol. You got your cucumber crop, it's got some whiteflies coming on it. You go down the biocontrol shop, you get some Incarcia, you put some Incarcia in, they then go and lay an oviposit on the whitefly, their populations increase, and hopefully you restore an ecological balance. Inundative release is where the biopesticides fit in. So you've got some caterpillars on your cabbages, you go down the shops, you buy a tin of dipel, Bacillus thuringiensis. In that 500 gram tin are billions and billions of Bt spores. Whack it in the sprayer, spray it over your cabbages. You've inundated your cabbage crop with Bt spores and bacteria, and the caterpillars eat them and die. And then conservation biocontrol. I like this because I kind of view this as really the most ecological technique, because we are really trying to here manipulate the ecological interactions between different species, and therefore it's agroecology. And so agroecology is essentially using ecological science to manage farm systems. So what we want to do is change the ecology we have on our farms to boost beneficial insects, to reduce our monocultures, and to bring our pests under control without having to get the sprayer out. To do this, you need to understand the ecology of the system, the ecology of your farm system, the ecology and the life cycle of the pests, the ecology and life cycle of the natural enemies that we want to turn into biocontrol agents, and what it's going to take to boost them. And in this space, I certainly personally, as he was my supervisor, go past the late, great Professor Steve Ratton and his many corny acronyms, one of which was SNAP, short for shelter, nectar, pollen, and alternative prey. So these are some of the ecological manipulations we're wanting to do on our farm systems to boost our beneficials. And for me in this space as an agroecologist, we're focused here on pest management, but agroecology as a systems approach isn't trying to just fix one thing. A herbicide just kills weeds. Agroecology, we want to try and change the whole farming system for our benefits. So all these things here, we kind of going, well, we want pest control here and that's our focus, but we actually want to achieve a whole bunch of other things, including the important one down the bottom, making more money. Now, I'm about to show you some really horrific stuff, and apparently now I'm supposed to warn you if I'm going to show you some stuff that might trigger you. So, we're going to go and have a look at a few biocontrol agents, and there's a bit of a theme here. The adults are really often very stylish. We look real cool. The offspring, I have to say, not so cool looking. So this is a ladybird larvae down in the bottom here. Some of the adults are actually pretty ghastly as well. So this is a tiny little millimetre-sized predatory mite. This is ones are tapping a thrip pupae. So this little guy here, he's a voracious predator of just about everything. I studied this guy for my master's, and they will eat everything apart from the thing I wanted them to eat, which was fly eggs. They'll eat each other, virtually anything. They'll actually eat bits of suck on plants if they're really hungry. But they are these very stylish little guys that are kind of whiz around in these little patterns, and hence their name. So carabid beetles, many different species of these things. They eat a wide range of stuff. These will attack stuff as big as slugs. There's species that attack weeds, so in some places these are important weed seed predators. They're kind of slightly smaller cousins, the rove beetles. Again, these are generous predators. Then we've got harvestmen. I was also studying these for my master's. These guys are really cool. If you get a hand lens and look at them, they're like a tank on stilts, just astonishing little things. Then we've got the hoverflies. Many different species of these as well. these, and again, the adults are very pretty. Their offspring not quite so pretty. So, semi-transparent slug with jaws. Nasty, nasty thing. Especially if you're a little aphid, as we will see in just a second. This is basically, if you're a little aphid, a Mysis persicae, peach potato aphids here, this thing is like a bus with jaws on it that's slimy and creeps and eats you. Just absolutely horrendous. You can actually see the aphids inside that it's eaten already. Yeah. PowerPoint slides, right. Pirate bugs. The adults are pretty cool, apart from this big stiletto on the front, which they use for puncturing and sucking the insides out of the prey. The lacewing, probably the most pretty of the adults, and therefore it has to have the most truly ghastly offspring possible on the planet. Horrible, horrible looking things with these nasty great big jaws on the front end of them. Again, these are generalist predators, so they'll take out a wide range of different pests. Parasitoids, these are parasitic wasps, so these are completely different from the European yellow jacket wasps that cause all the problems in our native forests. These are tiny little things, they're millimeters long. These are actually the original wasps, and they lay their eggs. The egg laying ovipositor was repurposed in the yellow jackets to become a stinger. And there's lots and lots of different species of these. Particular species of parasitoids attack particular kinds of pests. So they're quite species specific, and this is the last bit of video, so I can stop faffing around with this thing in a minute. Biocontrol of aphids. So this is Aphidius that attacks aphids, and that was an egg being laid, so that aphid is now toast. The egg will hatch inside the aphid and devour the aphid from the inside out. This aphid's a bit thick. Didn't notice it's just been killed. And so this is one that, a parasitoid that attacks caterpillars. I just love this photo. You just about read into that caterpillar going, I am so much shit here. And the caterpillar fights back. There's videos of this stuff. And the caterpillar fights, but once that ovipositor comes in and gives it a quick jab on the underside, it's all over. So, key messages: biodiversity and ecosystem services are what allow us to stay alive and do what we do. These totally exotic farm systems we have in New Zealand, there's not so much ecosystem services being provided, so we really need to give them more of our help. And our pest problems are our own fault. If we hadn't brought them over in the first place, we wouldn't have them, which is why we spend so much money on biosecurity, trying to keep the last few that we don't have out still. And conservation biocontrol is a key means of giving these guys a helping hand so they can help us back. So to me, it's all about taking this agroecological approach to not only just fix our pest problems, but also try and change our whole farming systems for the better and increase our profitability. Thank you very much. Green Wiper was a project that Steve Ratton initiated, looking to control leaf roller caterpillars. That's an interesting juxtaposition. So Steve Ratton was approached by the viticulture industry. They got leaf roller caterpillars. They're spending about $400 a hectare a year spraying for this, and over 3 PhD students. So this was kind of the early days of conservation biocontrol in New Zealand. 3 PhDs, they worked out that planting buckwheat 1 row in 10 about a month before, on and after Christmas would get the buckwheat flowering at the right time to boost the parasitoids that then took out the leaf roller caterpillars. What that was doing was a really targeted approach. So it was one pest, one crop, one farm ecosystem. They found the solution for it in terms of this buckwheat, and for about the cost of about $50 for the seed, the planting, a bit of irrigation required, they brought the leaf roller under economic threshold. That's one pest, one farm system. There's a lot of pests and there's a lot of different farm systems out here. So part of the approach we're doing here is we're kind of going, great, we can burn through another 3 PhDs and get one pest in one farm system definitively under control, but we've got lots of pests. So what we're doing here is the agroecological is a bit more of a blunderbuss approach. We have science that's saying particular plant species can boost particular beneficials, and we have linkages of what those beneficials will attack, but we're kind of going, well, what we're going to do is just boost biodiversity as a whole by planting quite a large range of different species of plants to provide the snap that's going to boost a whole range of beneficials that's then hopefully going to take and manage and reduce under economic thresholds a whole bunch of different pests. We're kind of crossing our fingers a bit. We don't know. This is the problem. One of the problems with ecology and why there's so many ecologists on the planet is it's really complicated stuff. You know, trying to work out all these different linkages in these systems, especially as it's basically one mental big feedback loop, trying to disentangle stuff in ecology is really, really hard, which is why Steve was doing this really narrow thing. But we don't have, 2 centuries and thousands of PhD students to try and individually do this one by one. So hence this much broader approach. Also with the thing that we need to improve biodiversity on our farm systems, and particularly with what we're doing here, we're going, well, we want to improve biodiversity, but we probably actually need to improve native biodiversity. So not only do we get our pest control, but the native species, plant species we're planting, will also hopefully look after some of our native insects. And then if we're boosting native insects, we're also hopefully boosting the birds and the stuff that are feeding on them. But it really is a bit of, we hope this is going to work. There's kind of some good rationale and general science underpinning it, but we can't give you a specific guarantee that any one particular intervention's going to have a causal chain that we fully understand. Don't get overwhelmed, take small steps at a time. Find a small corner of the farm that's not terribly productive, the corner of the pivot where the pivot doesn't reach, that kind of stuff. Get our lovely little booklet and look up some of the plants that we've suggested you plant, and just plant a small area to start with. So take this stuff in bite-sized chunks, and then when that's up and running and you're kind of going, I think I'm seeing some benefits here, then you can kind of go, let's go and do more of the farm. Probably not a good idea is to go and try and find every spare skerrick of land on the farm and plant the whole shooting match in natives in one go, because you probably have a whole load of them die because you couldn't manage them properly and look after them. So small steps to start with. Yeah, look, that would be perfect. So talking about landscape corridors, especially for our bigger organisms, the birds and stuff, if there's too big a distance between patches of native ecosystems that they need to thrive, they can't move between them. So this concept of ecological corridors, they don't have to be absolutely continuous, but patches of native vegetation that allow species to move from one to the other. So to me, if every farmer and grower in New Zealand actually did just plant a little area of natives, we would rapidly have a large mosaic of patches of native vegetation and allow our native species to then start jumping between them and thriving. But yeah, coordination would be a great thing.